Good afternoon. I'm Grace Yu, Vice Chair of the 1990 Institute. Welcome to the Rise of China in Asian Americans webinar. This event is co-hosted with the USC-US-China Institute and sponsored by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group in the USC-US-China Institute. The 1990 Institute's mission is to foster a constructive dialogue between the US and China and to promote fair and equitable treatment of Asian Americans. We strongly believe that better information and education will improve understanding and change the future. The complex and evolving US-China relations had changed the dynamics between the two countries and has had repercussions on Asian Americans. This webinar hopes to unpack the changing attitudes of our government, the resulting impact on the Americans, and what our panelists think could be done about the current policies. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time out from their busy schedule to participate in today's webinar. This webinar will be moderated by Clay Dubey, a friend of the 1990 Institute and the director of the USC-US-China Institute. Clay is an expert on China and its impact on the US and Asian Americans. His accomplishments are too numerous to list here. He is a publisher, editor, director, and producer of publications and documentaries on China. But most importantly, he is an educator. He's received numerous teaching awards, including the 2012 Perriman Fund Social Studies Educators of the Year Award for his involvement in education. Last but not least, he moderated and advised the 1990 Institute on its Teachers Workshop for the past few years, and now serves on our advisory council. Clay, many thanks for moderating this webinar. Take it away.
Grace, thanks to you, thanks to our sponsoring institutions, and to our wonderful speakers that you're going to hear from in just a moment. But we also owe a big debt of gratitude to each of you who are giving up your precious time to be a part of this discussion. We want you to be a part of that discussion, and you are able to do so to contribute questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to address those questions in the second half of today's webinar. In the first half, we're going to hear from three distinguished speakers. We have historian Gordon H. Chang, we have law professor Margaret Lewis, we have somebody with a foot in business, a foot in law, and somehow managing to have a third foot in government. Peter Liu Munoz, who's going to be speaking as our third presenter today. Before I formally introduce Professor Chang, I wanted to say something about the title of today's webinar, The Rise of China. Well, everybody who's a part of this discussion today knows about the rise of China. None of this is news to you. It took The Economist a little bit of time. They covered that rise of China, but only in 2012 decided to dedicate a section of the magazine to it. It was the first new section the magazine had created in 70 years. Now, China today has a gross domestic product of about 2/3 of the United States. It's growing at a faster rate, however, and even at 6%, China is adding about $840 billion to gross domestic product. That's greater than the gross domestic product of Saudi Arabia, greater than the gross domestic product of Turkey, greater than the gross domestic product of Taiwan. So it's a huge number. It's a huge number. And we can see it in skylines, we can see it in products, all of that sort of thing. On a per capita basis, of course, China with its 1.4 billion people has a much lower per capita GDP than does the United States, perhaps a sixth as much. But in terms of an aggregate economy, China has tremendous resources, and it can allocate those resources in specific ways. It can invest in its military. It can invest in developing new technologies for the future. And in fact, China has been very consistent in saying it intends to do these things, and it's been doing them. It needs to invest in this way, not just to compete, not just to be able to be a major factor in the global economy, but also to meet its domestic needs. It faces huge needs to increase its energy efficiency. It needs to increase its productivity. Now, how is the United States to respond? How is the United States to manage its response to this challenge? There are some people, of course, who call for decoupling, for cutting off Chinese access to US technology. They call also for limiting US-China scholarly scientific collaboration. Some want to restrict economic collaboration, cutting off the sales of key technologies or products. There are some who want to restrict the flow of Chinese students and scholars to the United States. And more people are calling for restricting Chinese companies' access to US capital markets. Those are the folks who want to decouple. But many others are calling for the United States to do what we have done in the past, to respond by investing in ourselves, by mobilizing our human capital, our tremendous financial capital, and through hard work and smart work, moving forward. Now, just yesterday, the architect of the so-called pivot to Asia during the Obama administration, Kurt Campbell, who now is the Indo-Pacific coordinator for the National Security Council, he spoke here virtually here in California about what? He said, this is the end of the period of engagement. But what we're going to see going forward is competition. And he emphasized that. Now, the second half of the title of today's webinar is "And Asian Americans." Everybody here knows that Asian Americans have contributed for more than a century to America's economic advance. And everybody who's on the call today know that they have not always been treated fairly, that they have been subjected to legal and social discrimination. Of course, such discrimination is unfair, unjust. It's also counterproductive. We're going to be looking at the rise of China and Asian Americans, who are the largest or the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States. We'll be looking at what they have contributed and how they can continue to contribute going forward. Now, our first speaker is, in fact, one of the top experts on the subject of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in American life. Professor Gordon Chang is a distinguished scholar at Stanford University. He's the Olive H. Palmer Professor of Humanities. He's produced several seminal works. I'm just going to mention two. Fateful Ties, A History of America's Preoccupation with China, and another book, Friends and Enemies, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, 1948 to 1972. He's also written on many, many other subjects, including the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese migrants who made that possible, and a lot more. He's written on art. He's written on so many different other things. But he's not just one of the top scholars in this field. He is also a leader at Stanford in shaping education. He's the Senior Associate Vice Provost for undergraduate education. Beyond that, he's worked with other colleagues at Stanford to produce useful materials for teachers to use at the secondary school level on teaching about Asian American history. He's a key public intellectual He's called upon to speak to a wide variety of audiences. He mentioned the other day that he recently spoke to 500 officials working for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We're fortunate that he's with us today. Professor Chang, the floor is yours.
I'm just going to make three general points to create sort of a broad context. Clay talked about the very current situation we're facing with U.S.-China relations, and even mentioned Kurt Campbell's talk yesterday. He spoke this talk was sponsored by Stanford, and I attended some of it. I couldn't attend all of it, but maybe Clay was able to be there the whole time. But he has correctly articulated the key point that Campbell made yesterday, which was that the era of engagement is over, and the new era in U.S.-China relations will be characterized as competition. But beside the immediate policy and economic and social and cultural issues of the moment, I want to just raise other contexts. One is that this question of Asian Americans, and more particularly Chinese Americans, and related to foreign policy or U.S. relations with other countries in East Asia, it's a historical one. It's not just a contemporary one. It's not one of just this current moment or past few years. But it goes back in some ways to the very beginning of the arrival of Asians in America in the 1850s. And as we know, tragically, most dramatically, with the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, is that international relations long very much affected the life and fortunes of those who are of Asian ancestry in America. So the current moment that Chinese Americans face is part of a continuum. So that's one context that I would like to establish. Another context, is that it's a very complex issue. I'll get to that in a moment. And the third, that it's quite an emotional issue. Going back to draw from some of my material in the book that Clay mentioned about Fateful Ties, that the relationship between the United States and China, culturally, socially, politically, economically, militarily, I argue it's particularly fraught. It is long that emotion is a very large ingredient in this relationship. Beyond policy issues, beyond calculations of national interest, there's another dimension which is a bit intangible, and that is that there is something, I would say, peculiar in the attitude, and here I'll speak of the Americans, towards China as both friend and foe, as both adversary as well as a land of curiosity and attraction. Now, those are three sort of themes I'll just sort of mention as I go through just a few slides here to set the stage in a sense. I think we all, unfortunately, probably familiar with some of these images of persons who look Chinese American getting assaulted on the streets of the country, increasingly so over the past year and a half. And these assaults often are attacked by racial slurs and some connection to being agents of the COVID virus, bringing the COVID virus in the United States, and Asian Americans being responsible, Chinese Americans being responsible for the epidemic. And because clearly these are terrible tragedies, but also indicate a long-standing suspicion, an alienation of Asian Americans in American life, that Asians at many times are seen as deeply, indelibly foreign, eternally alien, perpetually foreigners, as is said, in the country, and also undesirable, more than even undesirable, as being social threats in a medical sense. And this is so even this current issue of anti-Asian violence that we see in the country, often very much connected to what I would say is the former President Trump inciting violence and accusation against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans with his slurs about the China virus and so forth. And so that's very much part of our current moment as well, I think, that we unfortunately see. Now, this goes, I can talk a lot about the 19th century, but these are just some scenes. Some of you may be familiar with these terrible images of Asians, Chinese Americans in American life. And you can see right here in this 1882 poster, magazine cover of a ghoulish Chinese in San Francisco Harbor. And you can see right up here the issue of diseases and other accusations against Chinese Americans. So there's a continuity of this issue of undesirability and medical threat that goes all the way back to the 19th century. And then we have, as we know, the widespread anti-Chinese violence that swept through the country in the 19th century that culminated or crested with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, that was actually an international act. Now, that caught Chinese Americans in between, in a sense, between China and the United States. But it was legislation that was very much involved in US-China relations at the time and passed through required extensive discussion between the Chinese government and the United States government about the legislation. And Chinese who were in the country were caught in the midst of this legislation and this effort. So it is in some ways is a predecessor to some of the things we see today. Now, we can focus on the negative aspects of US-China relations, where Chinese Americans have been caught in a terrible position between two great powers, and the fortunes of the Chinese Americans being dependent somewhat on the two powers. But we can also remember that there are times when the relationship was a geopolitical relationship was close, and Chinese Americans welcomed this closeness. Here we see the famous 1943 trip of Madame Chiang Kai-shek coming to the United States, coming through San Francisco, and also visiting Washington, D.C. with a very high publicity visit where she was a star celebrity at the time and received huge welcomes in the major American cities wherever she went, including among Chinese Americans, as you see here in this interesting photo as it welcomes Madame Chiang. And Chinese Americans very much welcomed her visit and her support for the ending of the Chinese Exclusion Act and for calling for more equality for Chinese Americans. And then after World War II, much of this support for the Madame Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists continued. And there were strong elements among Chinese Americans who were quite anti-communist, who welcomed the advent of the Cold War and the hostility against mainland China and support for nationalist China. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we even think about the current tensions between the United States and China. That it is important to keep in mind that Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, and Chinese Americans in particular are not monolithic, but have many different communities within the Chinese American rubric, and some of which are, I think some of us already know, certainly welcomed Trump's hostility and slander against China for various reasons. So it is also a complicated story. It's an emotional one, and we can see pictures like this, and I think they probably set off sorts of emotion, as we see at the height of the Sino-Soviet Alliance with the meeting of Mao and Khrushchev as the leaders of the communist world. And then within just a fairly short period of time, China reversing courses and finding a new friendship with the United States, here symbolized by his famous meeting with Nixon in 1972. So the geopolitical relationship is often in flux. It changes very quickly sometimes. Now, it was, one thing I just would say, it was after Nixon went to China, many Chinese Americans, including those who were very anti-communists, welcomed the trip because it harbored the era of a new era in US-China relations and opening up of the relationship and new possibilities, which did come about through business relationships, cultural relationships, travel, tourism, new immigration of Chinese from Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, coming to the United States. And I would say after in the 40 years or so after Nixon went to China, it was a period of, even certainly where there were many tensions, but there was a period of much welcome of Chinese Americans, at least formally, and the rise of the so-called model minority, which included certain Chinese Americans, and the sense that Chinese Americans had benefited and were benefiting from the global order headed by the United States, and centered here, certainly in the United States. And I think many Chinese Americans also believe that, which is one of the reasons I think that the era of Trump and everything that he said was so shocking to many Chinese Americans. And today we have many speaking out against the violence against Asian Americans. And in part, I think there's a sense of a rude awakening that things were really not so good after all in the United States. And the United States was not as welcoming as it once thought it was, including all the way up through the Obama era, even though that began to change, as Clay mentioned, with Kurt Campbell, who was very close to Obama and the self-proclaimed architect of the pivot to Asia, that things changed very rapidly from Obama to Trump. Now, as we go forward, and I'm sure the others on the panel will have lots to tell us about, I would just say I'm very concerned about going forward. I think that the poison that Trump has unleashed or tapped in the social life of the United States will not go away soon. The geopolitics will continue to be challenging for the reasons that Clay mentioned. And so I think that this is going to have great repercussions for Chinese Americans in the areas of intellectual life, professional life, trade, careers, and even personal security on the streets. So I think there's a lot to talk about, both in terms of like current conditions, but also as history. So I'll stop there.
Gordon, thank you so much for that. We'll definitely want to come back to some of the questions that you've just raised, how we can cope with the emotional, the identity questions. Our next speaker is Professor Margaret Lewis. And Professor Lewis has made a big sacrifice. She's up very early in the morning to be part of this discussion because she's currently based in Taiwan. While being based in Taiwan, she's been teaching law at Seton Hall University and continuing her research. She is a distinguished scholar looking at criminal justice systems. She's published on criminal justice in China, in Taiwan. One of her books, co-authored with Jerry Cohen, is Challenge to China: How Taiwan Abolished Its Version of Re-Education Through Labor. But we've asked her here because she is a very important public intellectual as well as scholar. She has testified before the U.S. government through the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission. She's participated in the U.S. State Department's legal dialogue with colleagues from China, and she has experience as a practicing attorney, all of those sorts of things. But what really brought her to this topic is her wonderful article, Criminalizing China. And it has been published. You can read it in the journal. You can read it online, and I commend it to you. She is a fantastic speaker, and we're fortunate that she's part of today's discussion.
Obviously, I am not Asian American. I come to these issues as someone who has long studied China, particularly human rights and criminal justice. And I also teach US criminal law, which has become increasingly relevant to these questions. I do appreciate being included in this conversation because I think allyship is key as we address the reverberations of foreign policy and these foreign relations on the domestic US situation. And so with that, what I want to do is go to this idea of competition, because as has been raised, that Kurt Campbell yesterday said, which has already been increasingly in the framing, but he made it crystal clear. And I quote here that the dominant paradigm is going to be competition with China. Now, I do hope, of course, that we can have collaboration on real existential threats like climate change for the sake of my 6 and 8 year olds, which I would be up at this time regardless. But I do think that this idea of how to address scientific and technological competition is going to be with us for a long time. And I do want to be clear that there are real national security threats, that the PRC leadership has made clear its intent to pursue indigenous innovation, which is to be expected as a country's economy develops, but the incentivizing and sometimes even directing of activities that are illegal under US law is something which we have become increasingly aware of. My question, though, is how do we respond to those threats, and how do we not escalate those threats beyond what they really are? So what I'm going to do in my short time, because I know we have a lot of people and a lot of questions, is to briefly introduce what is the China Initiative, and then explain why both I and a number of other people have been arguing that there's a better approach to dealing with the scientific and technological competition with China. So with that, so what is the China Initiative? You may have heard of it. It's a Department of Justice situated initiative that actually began in 2018 when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General. Now, it wasn't completely new. The concerns about economic espionage predate the China Initiative. And economic or industrial espionage, what that is trade secret theft. So stealing a company or someone's intellectual property and doing it with the intended beneficiary being a foreign government or an entity that has a tight nexus with a foreign government, if not the government directly. And so this concern that there'd be intellectual property theft occurring and it would be sucked over to China and be used as a way to compete even better with the United States using illegal means. So it started in 2018 under Sessions, but of course, just a few months later, Sessions was no longer Attorney General. We had Barr come in and he ran with this idea. And what we've seen and continuing under the Biden administration is this emphasis not only on economic espionage, but also related or sort of lesser crimes, though still serious crimes under US law for things like grant fraud. So failure to disclose required information about relationships with entities in the PRC when applying for grants that are federal grants. So with the National Institutes of Health, wire fraud, tax fraud, failing to disclose income received from PRC entities, and even having foreign bank accounts that you haven't disclosed as required, which can all be not just crimes, but really felonies and serious crimes. Now, what we have under the Biden administration so far is not that long of a runway that we've actually had Attorney General Merrick Garland in. So I'm still hopeful for a course correction, but I want to give some reasons why I think there's a smarter approach to dealing with these concerns. And again, there are some real concerns about these trade secret theft issues, but how do we deal with that in a way that's going to put the United States in the best competitive position possible, not only dealing with China, but with the rest of the world, because it's not just about China. We don't want our intellectual property that's situated at US universities or companies running off to France or Colombia or Canada or anywhere else. We want to try to keep it domestically situated. So first, I want to make clear that a large-scale Department of Justice initiative named for a country is by all accounts unprecedented. And I think that's important because what it does is it lumps together these cases under this China umbrella and talks about a China threat and even anthropomorphizes China into this entity that it itself, like what is China stolen and China's thefts. And that's, I think, a real issue because it creates a framing of a xenophobic existential threat instead of focusing on individualized assessments of criminal liability because guilt is individual. And I think that framing itself is problematic. So second, the rhetoric used in the China Initiative depicts people who have connections to China as risky and deserving enhanced scrutiny. Now, the Trump administration's worst rhetoric has been dialed back. We saw under the Trump administration, for example, political appointees in the Department of Justice flat out questioning the loyalty of naturalized Chinese Americans. And we don't see that under Biden, but we still see press releases that will start with things like someone had a strong ties to China and emphasizing that as part of the concern. And I think at a minimum that alludes to heritage ties and ethnicity, even if not stating it directly. And for that, I would say the Justice Manual, which is the manual for federal prosecutors, makes clear that prosecutors should not be influenced by a number of factors, including a person's race or national origin. And so part of that, even if it's not explicitly influenced by, my third point is that influenced by also includes implicit bias, not just explicit bias. And that's important because law enforcement, prosecutors, investigators, they're human beings, which means they do have implicit bias. And we need to see that being addressed. But what we've seen is a national security dominant framing that puts that as the real concern is national security without considering how unconscious bias might be framing how investigators are looking at these cases. And I think that's something which I really hope the Biden administration will take steps to address. Fourth, this legitimate desire to increase security consciousness, that's a fair desire. I think it's overcorrected. And we've gotten to the point that it's not just deterring behavior that is negative and illegal, but it's actually having a chilling effect on our ability to retain and attract the best and brightest minds. And we need to have talent from abroad, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. So as an example, a June 2020 National Institutes of Health presentation regarding foreign influences on research integrity reported that 82% of scientists under investigation were, quote, Asian as their race. And that's very clear out there in the scientific community. I spend a lot of time talking to scientists who are Chinese American and how they're feeling under enhanced scrutiny. And that effect is real, regardless of the intentions of the Department of Justice. Fifth and finally, I think a bottom line is that criminal law should be a backstop, not the forefront of protecting intellectual property. And there really needs to be more collaboration with the scientific community to find ways using sanctions, maybe administrative sanctions, improving of grant reporting requirements, and other ways to protect intellectual property and enhance research security without having to use the heavy hand of criminal law. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was terrific. And among your points, of course, was the emotional environment that labeling China as criminal, the impact that can have, and your emphasis on criminality as being individual, not something that's automatically shared with people who may share your ethnic background. We turn now actually to somebody who has some experience as a prosecutor. Peter Liu Munoz is coming to us as the General Counsel and Senior Vice President for Tech Policy at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And he may say something about the group itself as part of his comments. But before this, he has served as a deputy district attorney and has been a prosecutor for a variety of offenses. He has focused on looking at intellectual property litigation. That's something, of course, very much in this discussion, protecting the innovation of American scientists and American companies, that sort of thing, including those produced by Asian Americans. But he also works on data privacy issues, international trade, and migration, immigration policy. Because, of course, human capital is vital to American innovation and American advance. And it's not just Silicon Valley, but the American economy has benefited from the contributions of migrants from Asia, as well as native-born Asian Americans. We feel really fortunate to have Peter with us today. Peter, why don't you take it away?
It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I serve as General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Tech Policy for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, a business association representing over 350 companies that work in the innovation economy. So I come to this issue really from a business perspective, though I was very much interested in the prior comments of Ms. Lewis talking about the role of individual culpability and responsibility in the criminal system. And I'm looking forward to addressing some of those questions further in our discussion. There is no international relationship that is as fraught with tension, complication, and opportunity as that between the United States and China. I'll start my comments with a global perspective of that relationship and then consider the role and contributions of Asian Americans here in Silicon Valley. The 21st century has seen China reinvent and reinvigorate itself as a world power. The country has fashioned its own brand of capitalism that is largely directed by the state. and it has risen to become the second largest global economy. Now, how has the United States responded to this rise? And Gordon gave a very nice introduction to addressing that question. Well, the United States has really come to view China as both a partner and a competitor. China is the third largest U.S. trading partner, with over $600 billion in goods and services traded in the last several years. U.S. exports to China supported close to 1 million U.S. jobs. So the success of either economy, whether American or Chinese, depends on a willing trade partner in the other. But this economic success does not override suspicion. The U.S. has historically viewed its relationship with China through the lens of power. And this has been true regardless of whether the White House occupant is a Democrat or a Republican. Now, President Obama was a strong advocate for the pivot to Asia, but he was an equally strong advocate for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trading coalition of Pacific countries that was as much about international commerce as it was about creating a multilateral bulwark against the power of Beijing. Now, President Trump scrapped the TPP and assumed a much more aggressive posture with China. He viewed IP theft, currency manipulation, data localization requirements, and accusations of financial fraud as national security risks. He set off a cascade of escalating trade tariffs between the two countries. Now, President Biden appears to be taking a more diplomatic approach with Beijing, but we have already seen this year how delicate those relations are when the Alaska talks devolved into public denunciations from both sides. Now, these issues reveal a process of decoupling that Clay talked about, where both countries are disentangling from the other. Chinese foreign direct investment in America has declined in recent years. And on the other side, the U.S. Commerce Department has made it more difficult for American companies to do business with Chinese companies that have been deemed as posing a potential national threat. Additionally, during his term, President Trump worked to restrict student entry to the country by Chinese scholars. China is the largest source of international students to the United States. And this closing off of that avenue of education for Chinese scholars represented a massive loss in collaborative brainpower. In 2019, there were 272,000 students from China enrolled at U.S. universities. A survey of those students found that 9 out of 10 Chinese PhD students intended to remain in the United States after graduating. If we oust these students, they end up in countries that compete against the United States in the global economy. Now, as China and the US continue to drift apart, each views the other as a competitor across several different arenas. Technology is certainly the most obvious. The Made in China 2025 plan set to advance Chinese research and that digital innovation, that native innovation that was talked about. And it also looked to position China as a leader in manufacturing for emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics. Now, for their part, American policymakers have responded with proposals to ensure American dominance in these same areas. In fact, President Biden's American Jobs Plan, which just came out not too long ago, specifically calls for funding investments to help the U.S. outcompete what it terms a quote unquote autocratic China. Another battlefront between the two countries is political alliances. China's influence continues to stretch beyond the borders of its country with far-flung partners around the world. And under President Biden, the U.S. will likely return to a more multilateral approach to constrain Chinese growth, as opposed to President Trump's go-it-alone strategy. Now, let's turn briefly to the impact of Chinese nationals and Asian Americans more broadly here in Silicon Valley and in America's innovation economy. Now, we cannot understand Silicon Valley, its present or its future, without understanding the role of Asian immigrants and domestic-born Asian Americans. Nearly 1 in 6 STEM workers in Silicon Valley was born in China, and many more are of Chinese descent. But despite the presence of Chinese nationals and immigrants in varied tech jobs throughout the Valley, there appear to be constraints on the professional advancement of Chinese Americans and Asian American workers. The Harvard Business Review found that Asian Americans were the least likely group to be promoted from individual contributor roles to management positions in the tech, legal, and financial sectors. So where does Silicon Valley go from here? The current political moment is one of opportunity. I am an optimist at heart, so I see opportunity here. Increased attention to address historical inequities in our boardrooms and our communities is long overdue. But presence isn't enough. It is not sufficient that Asian Americans have high numbers of tech workers in Silicon Valley. They must also have a fair opportunity to assume leadership in the country, in the companies that shape the future of our region. The continued success of our innovation economy depends on diverse leadership from all communities that live and work in our region. With that, I'll stop here and I'll turn it back over to Clay.
Thank you, Peter. And that was wonderful. And I failed in my introduction to highlight your personal engagement in the political system as an elected member of the City of Gilroy City Council. And so thank you for your service there as well. But I wanted to pick up on where you were ending and put this question to all three of our speakers. We know something about the human cost of fear. We saw it, of course, with the internment of Japanese Americans. We've seen it on the streets with abuse directed towards Asian Americans, including Chinese Americans. And we know about the potential economic cost of fear. But knowing these things doesn't make the fear go away. Let me ask each of our speakers to address this question. What needs to be done so that the United States is a little bit more self-confident and a little bit less fearful? And so we can go in any order. Peter, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go back to Maggie and Gordon.
Great, thank you, Clay. And that is a very important question. How does the United States change its perspective with regard to China more broadly and Asian Americans? And I think first and foremost, I think we have to do a better job of recognizing the contributions of Asian Americans and Chinese nationals to the success of our innovation economy. I spoke earlier about the number of STEM workers that are Chinese of Chinese origin. Let me also point out that in Silicon Valley, we rely on nearly 60% of our STEM workforce that are immigrants. And when you think about that, that is the single largest concentration of foreign workers in an innovation region throughout the country, whether it's competing against New York or Austin or Seattle or anywhere else. So the innovation economy owes a tremendous debt to immigrants and to Asian Americans as a whole. So recognizing that legacy is important, and also recognizing, just from a strictly bottom line perspective, the rhetoric in and of itself that is xenophobic, nationalistic, ultimately only undermines the work that we're doing and the strength that we're doing, given our reliance on immigrants as a whole, and in particular, Chinese and Asian Americans. So I think a better understanding of the history, but also understanding too, to put it in really simple terms, it's skilled immigration from Asia and from other parts of the world. That's the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden eggs. And so we have got to make sure that our rhetoric and our mindset reflects just how important that relation is.
Thank you. The flow of talent to the United States is perhaps, is one of our greatest assets. Maggie?
Yeah, let me say three things on this because there's a lot packed into this question. So first, I really think it's so important to individualize, and this not is only because guilt is individual in the criminal context, but just more generally, as Professor Chang raised, that the Chinese Americans are not monolithic. I'm in Taiwan. Recently, there was a lot of people upset that Pew Research didn't give Taiwanese American as a choice, but lumped people together as Chinese American. And I think we really need to recognize that there's a lot of differences among the ethnically Chinese populations and also people who even are formally or connected to the PRC, huge differences there. There's some people who are supportive of the government there, some people who are not. So treat people as individuals instead of lumping them together. Second, President Biden has said words matter. They do matter. And I think we can both criticize the PRC leadership, the party state, the Chinese government, and also support that we have an environment in the United States that is embracing diversity and treating individuals with respect. But that requires careful messaging, and we're capable of doing it. We just need to do it. And then third and finally, I'd say that we really need to concentrate on making the United States stronger because that's the right thing to do, not because of China. And I'd recommend Ryan Hass's book, Stronger. Read anything that Ryan writes. He was formerly in the National Security Council and now is at Brookings. But we need better roads and bridges and faster trains in the US, not because China can build fast trains, but because we need faster trains. Anyone who's taken the Acela knows it is not really a fast train. So I think that's something too, that it's not always about looking to China as this other that's making it so we need to do things domestically.
Thank you. The motivation for doing this is because it needs to be done rather than just a response. Gordon?
I welcome the comments of the two other speakers just now. Let me approach the question a little bit differently and talk about the perspective and the issue of fear from the perspective of those who've been the targets of anger. And there, I would say, we need to do much more as policy and as leaders and so forth. But from the vantage point of those who've been targets of the violence, I think there's been tremendous damage already. And I think there's tremendous fear among Asian American communities and Chinese American communities in particular. Now, what's interesting, I think, about the fear among Asian Americans is that so many of the attacks have been directed as against ostensibly Chinese ancestry people. But the actual victims have been Filipino, Japanese, Latinx, they've been, dark-skinned people of some sort. It doesn't matter. It's been a racialized assault. And I think that, as we know, race is a very big problem in our country. And that boogeyman has been unpacked now and is not going to go away soon. And that as the problems with U.S.-China relations continue, I think it's very difficult for people to walk the line using separating issues directed in U.S.-China relations on an international level, or diplomatic level, and those at home. In part because this is the legacy of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. It's recognize Asian Americans here as Americans, but as extensions of whatever country in Asia. Now, I will end with just reminders of a horribly tragic incident just a couple of years ago. And that was the suicide of my colleague here at Stanford, the physicist Chang, who was a brilliant physicist in the prime of life, 55 years old, in line to get the Nobel Prize. He'd come from China, brilliant physicist in China, and this fits into the issue of talent flows. He came to the United States, studied, got his PhD in the United States, and got a prominent position in Stanford's physics department, and also went into business. He started up a big venture capital firm and was doing everything which, at that time in the 2015, 2016 time, was people were encouraged to do. That is, develop academic relationships, business relationships, and use their personal relationships to advance U.S.-China interaction. But then things reversed very quickly. And this is what people took note of. Now everything became the opposite. And all those things which are seen as positives became negatives. And the Hoover Institution came out with a report called China's Interest in America, China's Influence in American Interest, which I thought was a scurrilous report. A lot of it was that targeted Asian Americans, Chinese Americans as being many as agents, unwitting and witting agents of China's effort to affect American life and politics and economics. In the early draft of that report, Chang was mentioned as one of those who were supposedly exemplified this kind of agent. Within days of the release of the report, Chang jumped off his condo in San Francisco. It's not clear, his family does not say that it was directly connected to that report, but it was such a sobering and shocking event that that this has stood in as a symbol of the depth of this fear and danger that before us. There are other examples, I can't name people, but it's all around Stanford. Chinese ancestry researchers, engineers, scientists, medical research, know very well this very sensitive situation we're in. International students from China are not coming to the United States, as in the numbers they were. They're already going to other places. So the consequences have already been felt, and a great damper has been placed on the academic environment, with many of my colleagues already very, very reticent to be prominent in any way, even academically. There was a question in the email about people speaking out against this demonization of China and Chinese Americans. And from the standpoint of many of my colleagues, this is a very, very sensitive line to walk. Even if they want to say like this demonization of China is wrong for all sorts of reasons, but for them to even so, they know that immediately they will be seen as some, and not just seen, suspected, but some of them have already been demonized in social media and other platforms for their ancestry and for even the mild comments they've made about the danger of demonizing China.
A too real depiction of the consequences of putting this kind of pressure on individuals and the costs of treating people of Asian ancestry as though they somehow represent another country. A very vivid and sad depiction. And Professor Chang, you've highlighted that line, and it came up repeatedly in the questions that have been submitted, the line between how do we talk about the US-China relationship without in highlighting human rights abuses and other complaints that are quite important in the US-China relationship. How do we discuss the US-China relationship, including its areas of conflict and competition, while not feeding the demonization that you speak of, both for people of Asian ancestry and people who are not of Asian ancestry? How best to talk about this complex and difficult relationship while not feeding our internal problems?
Well, if I had an answer to that good question, Clay, I think I make a lot of money writing an op-ed piece very quickly. It's really a tough question, and I'm not going to prettify it all. And I think our other speakers have done very well to try to walk that line. To look, there are definite concrete issues, there are problems and conflicts, legitimate issues in U.S.-China relations that have to be addressed, and they should be addressed, but frankly and concretely. And not, I guess, try to avoid aspersions of the intent of to malign aim and this type of thing, but really focus on the actual content of issues. But it's not going to be easy, and I applaud President Biden for speaking out against anti-Asian hate. At the same time, he's proceeding with the new policy towards China, which I think is very much part of their organization, the administration's approach, and they're very, very firm in proceeding with what they believe is the traditional approach to rebuilding American power in the world, and making sure the United States stays preeminent and to protect its various assets and interests. So how to do both when it comes to Asia, it's very, very difficult. We saw that in the 1980s and 90s when the United States was in competition with Japan. And there were a lot of consequences for Asian Americans at that time as the U.S. ramped up the sort of anti-Japan and Japan Inc. kind of rhetoric.
No,
Clay, I was going to jump in. I think I think Gordon did a very, very nice job to kind of kick this off. You know, I'm reminded of what we saw at the Alaska talks earlier this year. I know I touched on that very briefly in my opening remarks, but what was so fascinating about that exchange to me was that what was supposed to be ostensibly just kind of almost like a meet and greet, kind of an initial series of feel-good talks, really devolved very quickly into accusations on both sides of the parties between the US and China as to their own respective shortcomings on human rights. And it was fascinating to see that. And when the US party delegation raised human rights concerns, the Chinese delegation immediately came back with their own very valid claims too, saying, look, you're having problems with Black Lives Matter right now, and you've got your own issues at play here. So how do we have a thoughtful conversation recognizing important issues and important shortcomings? And I think there are a couple of ways to at least begin thinking about this. For me, it's initially, what is the purpose for raising those issues? Is it a desire to affect genuine change? Is there an opportunity for an authentic conversation around change? Or is this political posturing? Is this a way to score political points? So considering the purpose, I think also very strategically considering how those issues are raised. Is it done in a public setting? Is it done in a private setting that's off the record? I think those are very important considerations. And what we saw in Alaska earlier this year, in some ways, almost seemed like an ambush to the Chinese delegation. I'm not saying that it was, but I can see how they might have interpreted it that way. So considering the forum in which those concerns are raised. And then I think finally, is the person or is the party that is raising these issues, do they have the credibility of doing so by getting their own house in order before they speak and making sure our discussion and talk around issues is consistent and aligned with our own past practices? So I think those are just three things that we can consider as we try to have serious conversations about important issues.
Just to jump in on Alaska and human rights. So first of all, Alaska, a lot of that was performative. I mean, the cameras were in the room, people were performing for domestic audiences, and we don't know what happened when the cameras are gone. So I don't put too much stock in that. But this bigger issue about whataboutism, and that I hear this all the time. It used to be, I go to a human rights dialogue and it was, what about Guantanamo, or what about Abu Ghraib? And I've heard that for years. I mean, my first response is always, I do not work, nor have I ever worked for the US government. And I criticize my own government all the time. I've kept my job. In fact, I've gotten, praise from my university for standing up for human rights. But then also more recently, people in China and the Chinese government are very aware of the anti-Asian sentiment, and they're using that as talking points. That's an own goal for the US. So what I say to that is, well, let me tell you about the work I'm doing with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and new organizations like the Chinese American Scholar Forum. And if you're in the United States and you want to set up a group to deal with these issues, you can just invite people over. It's called freedom of association. You might have to register if you want tax benefits, but there's fundamentally different ability as civil society to counteract the government. And so I do worry sometimes that it turns into, yes, the US needs to do better on its own human rights, but we're fully capable of criticizing other countries at the same time.
That's right. And the point about being able to organize to combat this, to mobilize, to file lawsuits, to do that sort of thing, that happens every day here in the United States. Professor Lewis, I wanted to ask you a question. You cite Andrew Kim's paper in your Criminalizing China, and Kim traces, although he talks about the China Initiative in that paper, but the China Initiative comes about during the Trump administration. But the cases that he tracks go from the 1990s up till 2015. And he found patterns of discrimination well before this. And I was wondering if you can address that question, because that gets at this likely suspects perception that if the FBI or some other agency is charged with honing in on economic espionage, intellectual property theft, that sort of thing, that they go in a particular direction.
Here, this is where I get law professory, that to say discrimination or racial profiling, that's different than just having a larger percentage of defendants or subjects of investigation sharing certain characteristics. And so for the Andrew Kim paper, which, as you noted, ended with its data before the China initiative, but there's efforts now happening to update that data by a couple of different organizations. Of course, it's very hard because to get information from prosecutors, that's difficult until we get close to trial. Most of these cases plead out. Investigations, even harder. FBI Director Wray has famously said that China-related investigations open every 10 hours. That tells us nothing other than a lot of resources are being put into the China initiative. And then you put national security on top of it, and it's even more difficult. So I want to say that people are doing these efforts with basically both arms tied behind their backs. But it doesn't surprise me that you're going to have a higher percentage of defendants have perhaps ethnicity and or historical heritage ties to China, if indeed this is the focus is that the Chinese government is putting more efforts into incentivizing theft. That could just be because there's an increased prevalence. And what we're trying to sort out, is there an increased prevalence, or is it really that people are being racial profiled? So, and here too, I think we should differentiate between some of the most bombastic rhetoric of the Trump political appointees and some of the civil servants, the people who have been working long-term in the Department of Justice and FBI, because I think they genuinely believe that they are following the behavior to wherever it leads. But again, this is where I get back to implicit bias, that even if there is not an effort to say we're going to highlight names that look Chinese, but it can still affect behavior of prosecutors. And we know that from studies, particularly of how Black and brown people are treated in the criminal justice system. And that has not been taken seriously. So I think we need to do more with that. And I think too, we need to recognize the qualitative experience. And Professor Chang has raised this, that again, I'd recommend the Chinese American Scholars Forum. They have a number of webinars because, even if we can't prove through a regression analysis, the reality is that people do feel targeted because of who they are, and it is having a really devastating impact on American competitiveness. So that should be taken seriously.
Thank you. We're going to stay with the program for a few more minutes, but we'll have to unfortunately bring this to an end. I'd like to ask a question for all three of our presenters again, and that's the question of both economic cooperation and scholarly cooperation, scientific cooperation. And this has to do with the increased attention given these kinds of ties. And Peter and others have already highlighted how productive this collaboration has been, how it has led to breakthroughs. But Professor Chang mentioned that there are right now fears about working with colleagues in China, not just among people of Chinese ethnicity, but among others. They are raising these kinds of questions. And maybe something could be said here about how to get the benefits of collaboration without and simultaneously reducing the risks. And Professor Chang, maybe we could speak with you first.
Well, just one thing I'll start off with saying. We only have so much under our control, as academics and as public speakers and so forth. And I don't know what the Biden administration is going to go in. We also have so little influence over what would happen from Beijing. And my hope is that Beijing will not do stupid stuff. And I'll say that quite bluntly. And it's very possible it can start to do stupid stuff. I don't think they've been doing a lot of stupid stuff in US-China relations. The level of espionage and this, I think, has been fairly low level. I think a lot of the cases, and Maggie would speak much more about this, and Peter, but my understanding of most of these cases are fairly small case, and many of them, I think, have come up because the Justice Department has been under pressure to produce, and so they find people who didn't disclose this connection or didn't get this money, but it's a few $1,000s here, or something happened a few years ago. There are a couple of high-profile cases, but all in all, compared to other security issues from other countries in past years, I don't think they amount to a whole lot. Now, so what I would hope is that will continue. That is to say, that we won't have really serious matters, and that over time, it will be more clear to those in authority on both sides that collaboration is in both people's interests, and that they will ratchet down some of the more extreme positions, so that the practical results from trade, from intellectual exchange, educational exchange, cultural exchange, I'm trying to be optimistic here, will win out over, but it's going to take some time to get back to that position. It's never going to be like what it was, I think, in the early 2000s, where there was sort of a glow. Big business in the United States was all agog and for what could be done in China. And then that turned another direction. And I don't think we're ever going to get back to that position, but a position where we do have sort of a sober-minded interaction, I think hopefully is possible. And that would be to the benefit of all of us.
Well said. Peter, Maggie?
Clay, I'll jump in very quickly. I think, one of the themes that Maggie had raised earlier about really getting back to the individualized nature of criminal liability and away from this kind of blanket suspicion, I think is certainly from a legal standpoint the right thing to do, and certainly something that should be pursued. But also from a collaboration and an academic research side of things, I have many conversations with research institutions throughout our region here who are looking at present federal bills right now that actually seek to place certain restrictions and requirements on those academic institutions for reporting who they meet with, and if they're receiving a certain amount of funding from one type of group versus another, and it really does seem very narrowly targeted to a lot of the fears and the suspicions around Chinese influence. And these are academics who are doing R&D, who are doing a lot of early stage research in emerging technologies. So I think moving away from that blanket suspicion is hugely important for setting an environment where people who are considering coming to the United States for education, for collaboration, for research, are more willing to come here than to go to some of our global competitors.
Or to stay at home. Professor Lewis.
Yeah, so on this issue of research security, our open science model comes with some inherent vulnerabilities, but it also comes with collaboration, which has made it so great. So I do think it is a totally fair and necessary question to ask, what kind of research security do we need? But that should be done in a country neutral manner. And it should be looking at what kind of intellectual property do we want to protect, not focused on a China framing. And just last, I'd say that I first went to China in 1995. I'm part of that crew that had sort of the halcyon days of Jiang Zemin and then the Hu Wen period, who had a lot of in-country time. I think it's absolutely stupid that the United States has stopped the Fulbright program to Hong Kong and China. I've never seen a strategy that says compete better by knowing less about whom you're competing with. And I really worry about the future of China analysts in the United States, because we both need the flow of students and scholars coming from China to the United States. And we need people in the United States who understand China. And so engagement has been tarred as this terrible thing, but we still need connectivity in order to avoid, the worst of the missteps and to actually understand what's happening there. So that's my final plea.
No, thank you for that. And I think all three of our presenters have asked that we operate from reality, that we operate from actual action, behavior, practice, looking at this, and also calling for greater exchange, even if that exchange might be painful because it is direct and it's honest and those sorts of things. I'd like to, first of all, thank our presenters, but also invite each of them if they have some final words for us here. And let's go in reverse order. So we'll start with Peter.
Clay, I'll just wrap up by very briefly saying, first off, thank you to the organization for allowing me to speak today. This is such an important topic, something that is incredibly important for our innovation economy and the member companies that we represent. I will just leave on an optimistic note that I don't think our relationship is beyond repair, despite the current challenges we faced. I really do believe there is an opportunity that if we are selective and wise in how in which we raise our concerns, whether they're legal, whether they're human rights based, if we pick the right time and the forum for doing so, and we continue to encourage productive collaboration, I think there is more to be gained working together than there is viewing China solely as a competitor. Clay, thank you again.
Thank you. Professor Lewis, Maggie?
I'll just add, again, I'd say Chinese American Scholars Forum is doing some great work and so has some excellent webinars if you want to do more into this issue. In the short term, I am worried that the violence is going to, if anything, perhaps increase as people are out and about more in the United States before it dies down. So I would encourage people to do bystander training, go to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, some other organizations, so you have the skills to know. Hopefully this will never happen, but I think empowering people to know how to help out in the moment is something, unfortunately, we still need to grapple with.
Be an observant bystander, intervene if possible. So please, Professor Chang, Gordon.
Maggie, thank you for that. That was very, very important to say. Just a couple, one thing we didn't talk about, and we could just go on forever, is the issue of Taiwan. And if talk about areas of real problem, and also what it means for Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, that could be a whole issue in itself. But so it's a really, really touchy issue, an explosive issue. Second, maybe some of you saw the news article the other day about a couple of Chinese business executives meeting with the president of the British Society for the Study of Jane Austen. He was embarrassed to say that they knew more about Jane Austen than he did, going back to what Peter and Maggie have been saying about how so, we need to know more about each other, not less. And that's a telling example. And the third, I'll just go back to a comment made in in the chat here about mentioned Beth Lou Williams's book. The name of her book, she's a scholar, a historian at Princeton, The Chinese Must Go. And I think that the attendee misunderstands what her book is about. Her book is about the history of anti-Chinese movement. She is not promoting the idea of Chinese must go. She's using that as the slogan that was used at the time. I know that pretty well because Beth was a student of mine at Stanford, and she's really quite marvelous. So check out the book, and I think it does give us some good historical perspective on the depth of anti-Chinese feeling.
Yeah, so again, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge a book by its title. Make sure that you're taking away the intended message. All three of our speakers have called for all of us to learn more, to be more engaged. Each of us as individuals have a role that we can play. And I'd like to encourage all of the attendees and the people that you're going to share the resulting video with to continue to engage with these three organizations. Now, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, it has resources on its website. It's an advocacy organization. It talks about specific bills and things like that for its member organizations, member companies. Very important organization. Take a look at their website, draw on those resources. The 1990 Institute has a wealth of resources on the US-China relationship, on the role of Chinese Americans in our society. All of these groups have various activities, including webinars such as this one. My organization, the USC-US-China Institute at china.usc.edu, apologies for the plug, go to that website. We have a lot of resources, including interviews that we have done with people who are charged with carrying out the China Initiative, as well as scholars who have been victimized by scurrilous attacks or prosecutions, as well as a host of other resources on issues such as Professor Chang mentioned, the Taiwan issue, the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, the relationship between China and Taiwan. So please get involved, connect with these organizations, get on their mailing list, and talk with friends, talk with colleagues. Each of us has a role to play. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to having you again at one of these webinars and maybe even in person one day. Thank you, folks. Goodbye.